Yeah, of course. So welcome everybody. Before I pass it to Carrie, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the structure from the technical perspective. We have muted folks joining the call. That's not because we don't want to hear from you. That's just simply to help manage the number of folks that we were expecting to join today. As our presenters come online, they will unmute, but we're really going to be relying on the chat function today. So if you have not found that yet, I would ask that you take a moment. There should be a bar associated with your Zoom screen right now that gives you some options, and there is a chat function built into Zoom. So if you want to take a moment to find that, what we're going to ask you to do is to just introduce yourself in the Zoom chat area. We will be monitoring that throughout today's session, and Carrie will be using that as a way to facilitate input from you all, as a way for you to ask questions of some of the people presenting today. So wanting to be sure everyone feels comfortable with that. So I'm going to pause for a moment and make sure I'm seeing people introduce themselves in the chat area. So we're welcoming Paul from St. Michael's College. We have a great lineup of friends from Vermont Works for Women. We have Sarah from UVM Women's Center. Welcome, Sarah. I love your mug. I wanted to say that earlier. We have Roni from Vermont Works for Women. Carrie from the Commission on Women. And I will let folks read those as they come in. I'm assuming that everyone's able to read that. So beautiful. So I am here if there are technical things come up, but I'm going to go on mute and I'm going to pass the baton to Carrie to kick us off. Today's session is being recorded. I did want to let everyone to know that as we want this to be a resource. So just a heads up on that. All right, Carrie, the floor is yours.
All right, so welcome. My name's Carrie Seacrest. I'm a commissioner on the Vermont Commission on Women from Brattleboro, and I also have my own leadership development company. And I really want to welcome everybody here today. On this first day of spring, down here in Brattleboro, we have about 2 inches or so. And so I'm choosing to look at the snow as a blanket of cleansing as we move into the day and these uncharted waters that we're in. So first of all, just acknowledging thank you for everybody who was able to be on the call, and shift and flexibility seems to be the name of the game these days. And I just wanted to offer as we enter into this morning is that there's an opportunity. There's so much unsettledness that we don't know that's going on in the world. And yet in this 90 minutes, there's an opportunity to really settle in and take some focus on a place that we do have control. If you think about Stephen Covey, he talks about sphere of concern versus sphere of influence. And concern is the stuff that we care about, but we don't have any possibility of making shifts. But our sphere of influence is a place that we can actually make changes. And as we think about today's conversation about equal pay in our own companies, this is a place where we actually have some possibility of doing good while there's so much unknown in there. So I just wanted to offer a way of thinking about this morning as a conversations for both possibility and action as we move into it. The other piece that I wanted to share with you kind of transparently is the purpose of today. So there's a few purposes. One is that this is the first time that we've brought compact signers together, and we want to build momentum for change on this issue. And what's an unintended consequence of moving to virtual is we actually doubled the number of people who wanted to participate. So we had 45 sign on, and although everyone won't be here, I'm hoping that they'll be able to check out the resources or see this recorded line later on, or they'll jump on as they can. We also wanted to use this as an opportunity to raise awareness about the compact. When we started in January recruiting and coming up with this idea, we had 180, and we're now up to 201 signers. So we increased by 23 signers in this 8-week period, which we're really, really thrilled about. We hope that this will inspire the compact signers to take action, because as we know, it's largely a symbolic measure. You just sign on, and we want to actually support moving that dial, and then to learn a little bit from you what the challenges are. And then we're also using this at the commission as a way to pilot and see if this is something that compact signers will find useful for the future. So that's our overarching kind of purpose for the day. And I just want to open by saying huge acknowledgments, like working with the commission, in particular to Lily, raise your hand, Hannah, Carrie, raise your hand if I say your name. And then at the Change the Story, Tiff Bloomley's here. And then we've also had help from Jessica and Allie. And then Kelly Campbell, who you've already heard from, has been instrumental in making this happen. And then as well, I want to acknowledge Ariana Wammer from Burton, Katie Brenes, and JP Ishak, who will be speaking from the different businesses in Vermont. So thank you all for helping create this. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, who will speak about what the compact is. If I can make there we go.
Thank you, Carrie. Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Brown. I'm the Executive Director at the Vermont Commission on Women. And most of you have signed on to the Equal Pay Compact. And so you have a pretty good sense of what this is about. Some of you haven't, but I just wanted to kind of back up a little bit and talk about what this is and why we're doing it. So this is an initiative that we started in 2015, and the idea was for Vermont employers to be able to make a visible statement of their support for equal pay, both in their own workplace and in the state and the world in general. And so we ask employers to sign this very, very easy online form, and we've asked you all to talk about and consider steps that you will take to help move us towards equal pay. And so in some cases that can be looking at what's going on in your workplace and trying to make changes in your workplace. It can also be broader than that. So supporting programs that are developing leadership in women, mentoring programs for girls, that sort of thing. So we're trying to take a very broad view of what equal pay is all about and how we can all kind of do our part to address it. And we also have hoped that bringing employers together to share some best practices and to learn from each other can be a benefit of signing on to this compact. So we have, you all, when you signed on, you got a list of suggested strategies that you can use. We have brought you together today. We're very eager to find out what you think about this event today and other ways that we could support your efforts to move towards equal pay, both in your workplaces and outside of it. So one of the things that we've been working on at the Commission that you all may have heard about is the Change the Story initiative. And this was our partnership with Vermont Works for Women and the Vermont Women's Fund to bring together these three organizations working on program, philanthropy, and policy to all try to systematically address economic security for women in Vermont. And one of the main activities that we've been doing is developing research, looking at women's economic well-being in the state, and we've issued a number of reports, and we have a new one out just recently, and we're going to hear more detail about it. And to do that, I want to introduce Tiff Bloomley, who is the director of Change the Story, and she will share with you some of the insights and the data that we have in our latest report. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay, there I am. So welcome everybody, and I'm really, we're going to try to distill what's in our report, which is a pretty long report, hit on highlights and our recommendations, and then we will want to make sure that we have some time for questions. So that said, I'm depending on Carrie to be our timekeeper and keep us in line. So the report contains a number of demographic data points, but in this presentation, we're just going to hit on a few. You can change the slide, Carrie. So women identified Vermonters are over half the state's population, or about 317,000, 17,000 of whom identify as women of color. And one of the interesting points one of the interesting statistics that we came across is that nearly 40% of Vermont adult women have a college degree, which is significantly higher than the national average for women, 31%, and nearly 6 points higher than the rate for Vermont men. That said, the rate at which Vermont girls matriculate from high school to college is well below the national average of 72%, and it's the lowest rate in New England. And so if we look at women's economic vulnerability, they are economically vulnerable relative to men as reflected in a number of data points. They are a disproportionate share of Vermonters who live in poverty. While family status contributes to women's economic vulnerability, it's striking to note that over 11% of women who are single without dependent minors live in poverty, a rate that's nearly 4 times higher than the poverty rate for men with the same demographic characteristics. For single men and women with minor children in the household, the poverty rates are also strikingly different. Nearly 37% for women, which is 16% for men. If the children are under 5, that poverty rate for women shoots up to 47%. The poverty rates for women of color and women with disabilities are higher than aggregated census numbers in Vermont. So as this chart shows, women living with disabilities are more than twice as likely as women without disabilities to live in poverty. And poverty rates for women of color are higher. While white women have a poverty rate of 12% in the state of Vermont, the poverty rate for Black women is more than twice that rate at nearly 27%. And as Vermonters, we like to think that our state statistics are better than the national average. But the poverty rates of Black and Asian women in Vermont are actually higher than the national averages for those groups. Finally, members of the LGBTQIA community who identify as female are also economically vulnerable as relative to non-LGBTQIA women. They are more than twice as likely to be unemployed and food insecure, and they are more likely to have an income of less than $24,000. So work status is obviously a primary driver in determining an individual's economic status. And Vermont women work. 65% participate in the labor force, a rate that is 8 points higher than the national average. And 80% of those who are working full-time. But for all their work, nearly 4 out of 10 women who work full-time don't make enough to meet basic needs as defined by our state's Joint Fiscal Office. Throughout the world, women are economically vulnerable relative to men, and one measure of that relative vulnerability is the gap between women and men's earnings. The wage gap in Vermont currently stands at 16%. And has more or less hovered between 14 and 16% since 2007. And the question really is why is there a wage gap? And in this report, we decided that we wanted to explore that because there's often debate about even the existence of a wage gap. So 60% of the wage gap can be attributed to differences in the occupations and fields in which men and women work, and in time men and women spend in and out of the labor force. So here's what we know about where women work. Women are a disproportionate share of minimum wage workers. They are 45% of all full-time workers, but 53% of workers who earn less than $11 an hour. A full 80% of tipped workers in Vermont are women, and that's the highest rate in the country. Tipped work is often low-paid work because a state law allows employers to pay such workers hourly wages that are half the state minimum wage. Tips are assumed to bring those wages up to the minimum wage. And if they don't, employers are supposed to make up the difference. That said, minimum wage is minimum wage and not enough to live on. Indeed, national research indicates that the poverty rate for Vermont's female tipped workers is 2 times the poverty rate for all employed women. A significant share of working women are clustered in fields that pay low wages. Indeed, over 40% of women who work full-time in Vermont are in jobs that have been and continue to be majority female. As this chart indicates, 7 of the 10 lowest paying professions in the country are majority female. Among them, childcare, fast food and restaurant workers, personal care aides, cashiers, etc. And women are the significant minority in 8 of the 10's highest paying professions. But women's wages are also affected by time in and out of the labor force. As this chart indicates, women are 4 times more likely than men to cite family or personal obligations for working part-time, and 7 times more likely to cite childcare problems. Now, nationally, the rate at which women between 45 and 54 participate in the labor force has actually decreased, a trend that's attributed to women's disproportionate share of elder care. And these are peak earning years. The cost of leaving the workforce at any time is significant. Yeah, you can stay on this slide for a second, Carrie. You could stay on the previous one. There you go.
Okay.
Let's say you're 35 and you started work at 22. You earn the state's median annual income for women, $41,000, and you leave the workforce for 5 years until your child goes to kindergarten. You stand to lose $433,000, which includes salary, but also likely wage increases over that 5 years, retirement benefits, and Social Security income. Bing. So a number of studies over the past 15 years affirm that the remaining 40% of the wage gap is attributed to gender discrimination or bias, conscious or unconscious, gender norms and attitudes or expectations. So the economic impact of gender bias and gender norms are reflected in a study that found that in a survey of 10,000 families, on average, boys earned twice as much as girls for doing weekly chores, $13.80 versus $6.71. Or a finding that within a year of graduation, wages earned by men and women who had the same major, worked the same hours, were the same age, worked in the same occupation, in the same region and sector, and had the same GPA and went to similarly selective colleges, those wages were 7% lower for women within 1 year of graduation. The persistent gender norms and biases are reflected in a Pew survey performed this last July that exposed persistent gendered attitudes about parenting and small children and working. 76% of adults surveyed, that's men and women, said that it's ideal for men to work full-time, while only 33% said the same thing about women. Another study found that mothers who work full-time experience a 4% drop in earnings with each child born, while fathers actually experience a pay boost of about 6%. So why? Well, researchers have suggested that while we assume culturally that working mothers will be less committed to their work when they are caring for small children, we also seem to assume that fathers are more likely to be responsible, hardworking, because they are caring for their families. So women's economic status is significantly affected if they experience intimate partner violence or sexual harassment. A national study found that 83% of intimate partner violence survivors said that the experience affected their ability to work. 53% reported losing their jobs. 73% reported that their partners had stolen paychecks, public benefits, or drained their bank accounts. Now, sexual harassment takes a financial toll as well. Women in many low-wage occupations are a particular risk of sexual harassment. Hotel cleaners, agricultural and domestic workers, restaurant servers, tipped workers are especially vulnerable to sexual harassment. And the cost of sexual harassment extends beyond the individual to employers because of its impact on productivity and retention. So overall, 8 of 10 women who experience sexual harassment leave their jobs within 2 years, a rate that's 30 points higher than the turnover rates for all women. Now, our report notes also that women not only earn less, but they often incur higher costs. For example, they hold 2/3 of the nation's tuition debt. School-related debt is highest for Black women at $30,000, and for white women, it's about $22,000.
Am I in the wrong slide?
You are, but
Are
I'm
you?
right before.
Sorry.
Yes, there. That's all right.
Okay.
So this is what this chart reveals about student loan debt. And the next slide notes that there are a number of variables that contribute to women's higher student loan debt. T. Rowe Price interviewed parents of only girls or only boys to see if there were differences in what they saved or expected to contribute to their children's college education. So interestingly, while 50% of parents of only boys reported that they had saved money for college, this was true for just 39% of the parents of only girls. So parents of only boys were more likely to contribute to college savings plans monthly, to say that they had planned to pay the entire cost of college or were willing to prioritize college savings over saving for retirement. A number of studies confirm that women routinely pay more for some consumer goods and services, something that they've dubbed the pink tax. Now, New York City conducted a review of nearly 800 items to investigate where women might be paying more and what it's costing them. And overall, like, products for women and men cost about 7% more for women, 13% more for personal care products like body wash, razors, and deodorant, and 8% more for adult clothing. The total annual estimated cost of these differences, according to this New York City report, about $2,300. So, what's the cumulative impact of occupational segregation, a tight and expensive childcare market, gender bias and discrimination, and women's particular experience of sexual harassment and intimate partner violence? Well, among other things, Social Security benefits that are 40% lower than those of men. Today, a full 44% of Vermont elderly women do not have enough income to pay basic living expenses, regardless of whether they rent or own their homes. But there's a broader impact too, and it's something, this is a point that Change the Story has been trying to make throughout its life. Vermont faces serious labor shortages, and you can bet that if women are just 10% of the state's engineers or 15% of its coders, that we're leaving talent on the table, talent that is critical to Vermont's economic growth. We make a mistake by framing the issues raised in this report as women's issues. They're not. They are our issues. They affect our families, our communities, and the very economic future of our state. One state-by-state analysis indicates that if we close the wage gap between women and men of comparable backgrounds, education levels, and the number of hours worked, the poverty rate for children with working mothers would drop by nearly 76%, the largest estimated drop of any state in the country. Moreover, women's higher earnings would bring in an additional $1.2 billion to the state's economy. And that's not chump change. So we need to speed the pace of change for these young women, for the girls who have not been born yet. We've identified a set of 5 recommendations that are actionable, have been piloted elsewhere, and have the potential for significant impact. And I'm going to turn this now over to Carrie to outline those particular recommendations.
Thanks, Tiff. And I just also want to mention that if you have questions or comments, go ahead and put them in the chat, and then we'll have some time to address those questions after we're done here. So we have 5 broad areas of recommendations that we've identified for this report. Excuse me. And some of them are really policy oriented and things for the legislature and other policymakers to do, and some are things that employers can do or kind of people in their regular lives can do. So I just want to go over a few of the things that we've identified. So the first main area is to collect, publish, and use better data. What we have found in making all of these reports is that we can get a lot of the data that we want if we're willing to invest a lot of money and hire people and do major research projects. And then some of the data that we want, we can't even really get. And so we would really like to see institutionalized collection and publication of data. So we're really urging lawmakers in their decision making to ask for data, such as when they're creating workforce development programs, or when they're assessing workforce development programs, or when they're thinking about economic development initiatives and how to spend public dollars, that they're asking who's benefiting from this money, what kind of jobs are we creating, who are we hiring, who are we training, and are those the people that we want to hire and train. We have also found that when we're, oh no, not yet, sorry. When we're trying to understand where state contracts are going, for instance, are they going to women and minority owned businesses? We don't have a system in Vermont that allows us to assess that accurately. So one of the things we're hoping to do is to persuade the Secretary of State's office in developing their new business portal to ask new businesses when they register, are they women or minority owned? And then we have a way to kind of track that. And so if we want to incentivize state contracting to those businesses, we can do that. Or if we just want to find out how we're doing, we have a way to know that. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So things that keep women at work and that keep parents at work. Paid family leave, childcare subsidies, these are methods that can really help keep women in the workforce. And we saw from earlier in the presentation when Tiff talked about, women are much more likely to take time off from work to take care of family responsibilities. They're more likely to work part-time to do that. They're more likely to make career choices that they think will allow them the flexibility that they want to be able to take care of their family responsibilities as well. And so measures that we can take that help, first of all, distribute those family care jobs more equitably so that both mothers and fathers are taking time to take care of children, and that also allow women to, and parents in general, to take care of their families and take care of their work simultaneously and balance that more effectively are great. So some of those are things that employers can do, like having paid family leave, but then also there's a role for the state in general to play to provide a social insurance program that could cover paid family leave as well as additional childcare subsidies. Okay, next one. One of the things that we see in occupational segregation is that women are clustered in jobs that pay generally less and men are clustered in jobs that pay more. We would like to see those jobs mixed up by gender, but we would also like to see the traditionally low-paying jobs where women tend to cluster pay more money. So we really need to kind of step back and ask why it is that childcare providers, for instance, make so little money when we'd all, as we're kind of seeing right now, when we don't have childcare, everything else is a whole lot harder. Our whole society kind of feels the burden of that. It'll be really interesting actually to see if we have some different conversations after we come through this about the actual value of teachers and caregivers who are mostly women. So increasing the minimum wage is one way to do that, but also really kind of looking at what our pay structures are, how we're deciding how much we're paying different jobs and paying our employees, what it is that we're actually placing our value on. Next one. So as Tiff talked about, bias and discrimination are really at the core of a lot of the pay disparities that we see. And so there's things that we can all be doing to try to address that. Coming to a webinar like this, participating in programs like the Equal Pay Compact, like Business Peer Exchange, are all ways that individuals and employers can try to raise their awareness and see the impacts of bias and discrimination. Employers can look at their recruitment policies, look at where they're choosing to advertise, what kind of language they're using in their recruiting, and then also look at their promotion policies and see if there are things that they can do that might be removing some implicit bias that are maybe creating some hard to see obstacles that are affecting how many women are in leadership positions or how many women are applying or are being hired. And we also, Change the Story has some, you may have heard about the Let's Talk Gender conversation cards. This is an activity that if we were all together in person, we would be doing with you today. But these are cards that have some of the data from our reports, and then they also have questions about what kind of ways that you have seen bias in your work, ways that you have felt the impact of gender. Some of them are really easy questions for a group to talk about. Some of them go into much more depth. And it's a great way for a group to, in a very casual, informal way, have some conversations about the impact of gender. Can also be more structured. People in schools have used them, people in book groups, and those are, if you want a set of those cards, you can get those for free through Change the Story, and you can get those online. We'll send you a link after this to allow you to get access to that. And then our final area of recommendations is to increase women's presence in STEM and trades careers. And this goes back a little bit to the occupational segregation we were talking about before, where we really are seeing women clustered in low-wage jobs. And so programs that are trying to make some of these higher paying, more in-demand jobs accessible to women, so programs such as Vermont Works for Women runs. They can be training programs, they can be pre-apprenticeship programs. Vermont Works for Women is doing a lot of work with that. It can also be something that you're doing within your own company. So perhaps if you run a STEM or trades workplace, you could have a day that brings girls in to try some things out. Vermont Works for Women does the Women Can Do program, which gives girls a chance to actually get their hands on some of these non-traditional careers. Really, it's to be thinking about ways that girls can see the full range of opportunities that are available to them, and not just get stuck in our stereotypical ideas about what's an appropriate job for women and what's an appropriate job for men. Okay, so there's a lot more we could be saying about that, but I will stop there. I see that we have some people chiming in on the chat thing, so we'll check and see if we have any questions, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Tiff to be in charge of this.
I have been responding to some of these, some of the questions as they've been online. One of the questions that somebody asked is, have we partnered with Let's Grow Kids to kind of make the link between workforce development and childcare? And indeed we have, and the commission published a report on childcare and workforce development just maybe a couple of years ago, and it has affected their advocacy, and it's certainly, and we've been able to use that connection as well to make the link between, this is about economic development, in addition to making individual women's lives easier, because frankly, how many of us can afford not to work in this state? And so, but there's also an economic development piece of this, because there are many women who, say, according to polls, and these are national polls, that they want to work full time, but because of the responsibilities for caring for children and any expense related to that, or caring for elders, they can't find a way to make that work. So I am looking here, I'm not seeing questions. Any other questions? Why isn't it, so Paul, by statute, legislature is required to calculate livable wages. Why isn't there political will to codify annual research on the wage gap? Oh well, I think that, there, for one thing, you can calculate the wage gap on any number of, in any number of ways, right? So you can take a 1-year stat but in a state that's as small as Vermont, it's not terribly reliable. So we, for our reports, have combined 5-year data and used that as our current snapshot in time. I think that here's where I think you all can be very helpful, is in insisting the wage gap exists. I mean, study after study after study has demonstrated, you know, not only that the wage gap exists, but why it does, and suggested ways in which we could address this. But it has been very difficult politically, as you are suggesting, to for people to take issue with this, in part because women are going to college at a higher rate than men, and women are more visible as leaders in our culture, and so we've taken our foot off the gas and assumed that momentum will carry all of this forward. But in fact, a lot of women have been very much left behind in the economy, and the actual percentage of women in certain fields has gone down over recent years, particularly in coding and engineering. And so it's you know, that kind of data is critical, but we got to be we need to insist upon it. And that's where I think legislators and public officials can be very key in saying, we want to know more. If we're spending training dollars on for Vermonters, who's getting the training, as Carrie said, and what's it for? So I appreciate that, and I would encourage everybody to make the case for better data and consistent data. So the Lieutenant Governor has a question. I recognize that part of the pink tax is taxes on products that are specific to women, but I'm curious about the broader reasons the pink tax collections are so much greater on other products that both women and men buy, clothing, games. Are the underlying prices on the products also higher?
Can I address this one?
Please.
Yeah, so the term pink tax should maybe be in quotation marks. There are kind of two different issues going on here. There are taxes that women pay that men don't pay, or people who menstruate pay taxes on menstrual supplies. And this is something that some states have gotten rid of and some states have not. In Vermont, we recognize that there are certain kinds of things that are essential, like food and clothing, and we don't have sales tax on those, but we don't put menstrual supplies into that same category. And so that is one of the ways. There are other ways that I'm not a tax expert, I can't speak on. But when we talk about the pink tax in this report, one of the other things we're talking about is it's not a tax, but it's a higher price on the same products. So when you go to buy razors, disposable razors, for example, they're the ones that are pink or scented and marketed to women cost more than the ones that are marketed to men, even though a razor is actually just a razor. And there are many, many products like that that are that just simply cost more and people pay more for. And so that's one of the areas of discrepancy that doesn't have there's no functional reason for that price to be higher, but it has a greater impact on women.
Perhaps the color pink is more expensive.
Maybe the pink dye.
So, JP asked a question about, you know, do we have any insights into whether the current health crisis could exacerbate or possibly improve the wage gap, especially considering the impacts that we mentioned concerning hospitality, industry workers, servers, childcare, et cetera. I mean, I'm not an economist. What I have heard is that obviously many low-wage workers are service workers, and they work in places that depend upon a public presence. And whether they are massage therapists who have to see people face-to-face, or they are restaurant workers, or they are cleaning hotel rooms, etc. What I have heard from what I've read on the blogs of the Economic Policy Institute and some others is that, yes, this is going to have a disproportionately negative impact on low-wage workers, and a majority of those are women. And so I think the Change the Story partners are very concerned about the economic impact of all of this generally, obviously, means for many women who are being laid off currently, or have lost their jobs altogether. Let me see. So Kelly, so I think some of the ideas Vermont Works for Women is looking to address relate to the goal number 5. And so Kelly says, Ronnie, can I put you on the spot to share some of those ideas in the chat? Things that, and I see that you've now, you've posted something about the impact of the COVID-19 virus on nurses, teachers, flight and airline attendants, etc. But you also might want to post links about programs that you run at Vermont Works for Women that could address some of the recommendations in the 5th recommendation. Are there any other things, questions that people have? Carrie, how are we doing on time? Should we?
Great. We have a few minutes still if people want to ask questions. And I know for me, the first time I saw the data as it's flying by, it was overwhelming. And I was, so I wanted to just check in if anyone had a particular question, because Tiff's really skillful in kind of explaining what it actually means.
And, we can come back if there's time at the end, if there's a question that pops up. I see that Ronnie has put some stuff online now, and I would direct you to their website, vtworksforwomen.org, if you would like to learn more. And we will post it after this webinar. We'll post, links to all kinds of resources that will be helpful.
Yeah, great. So thank you, Tiff and Carrie, for giving this overview. And what I really appreciate, unlike the first 3 that just gave the data, this last report is now offering recommendations. And so, like Tiff said, one of the things we'll be doing is sharing all the links with the reports, but it's really helpful. And I found, as we're talking about the wage gap and is there a wage gap, et cetera, like having the numbers is so critical. And that's why these reports are kind of like this baseline of like, look, Vermont, we need to look at this. And I love the comment that Tiff put in there about, we like to think of ourselves in Vermont as like, oh, that's everybody else, but not us. And actually saying, okay, this is what's happening in our own communities, 600,000 people, and we can do better. So the intention of this portion of our webinar today is really to kind of do some like eye-opening of like, this is where we're at, and then inspire into like, okay, and now what can I do? There's clearly like, there is an issue and there's lots of ways that we can move into it. And so now I want to offer a few examples from companies who are doing work in the field. Who are doing work in the field. And before I get to that, I just wanted to mention part of the reason, just to kind of give you some framing, part of the reason why we're doing it today on March 19th is because on March 31st is Equal Pay Day for white women. And that's the day when equal pay equals last year's pay for men. And then it goes back for, I don't know the dates for Black women and Latino women. Do either of you have it off the top of your head? But it goes further and further into the year in order to have the Equal Pay Day. And so given that in companies, there's always it's useful to often have hooks or a reason why that we need to have this conversation. We're linking this a little bit today to be thinking about Equal Pay Day coming up on the 31st. There's always Equal Pay Day, and we've got a lot on our plates right now with what's going on in the world, but just to kind of keep it in your in the back of your head. So I'm going to introduce to you 3 individuals who have been doing work in their companies. The format that I'm going to offer is that you'll see there's these 4 questions that I've written on the slide. What are you currently working on? What are your drivers? What's the success, a challenge that you faced, and how did you handle it, and words of wisdom for other companies. So this is an opportunity for us to kind of learn from people who are doing some stuff on the ground and give you different flavors of how it's working. So and then I'll just ask them to speak for 5 minutes, and then after all 3 of them have gone, we'll open it up again for Q&A. So I'd first like to introduce Ariana Wammer, who is an HR business partner at Burton Global. And I'm going to change the stop share so that we can see Ariana.
Thanks, Carrie, and good morning, everyone. Happy to be here and to continue to have this webinar. Can everyone hear me all right? Oh, no. Yes?
Yeah.
Of course, my internet is now failing for some reason. Oh, are you all still there? Yes, you are. Okay. So yes, as Carrie mentioned, I am an HR business partner at Burton. I have been there for just over a year now, and I was asked to kind of participate in this panel to talk about my experience with, Change the Story and the Business Peer Exchange, which I joined as a part of a cohort of 3 from Burton in April of last year. So, to the first point of what are we working on and what are the primary drivers of this, the ultimate driver of our initiatives right now and what prompted our participation in Change the Story was kind of stagnant numbers around women employees in very specific departments. Our Senior Vice President of HR, Justin Worthley, has wanted to change this and has been trying to change this for some time. Burton actually participated in the very first Business Peer Exchange. I think that was 4 years ago. And it was a great introduction to the content. I don't think that our business was ready for it at the time. And so it was a good introduction, but I think this past year, unfortunately for me, the stars aligned as I participated in the group, and I think we were ready for real change at Burton. So the 2 goals that we created at the start of this last year and that was driving our work was around gender ratios. So gender ratios in both the targeted functions and departments, to have those at least 1/3 women to men in 3 years. So by 2022, it doesn't sound like a lot. I want to get it to half. There are much better goals out there, and it's a start for us. And so those targeted areas are the traditional, I guess you would say traditional areas of IT. We have like product, which is around engineers specifically. There were some shocking departments where it was more like marketing creative, and we actually quickly resolved those departments, but ensuring that those specific departments are at least 1/3 women to men in 3 years. And then further, our second goal driving the work was gender ratios, 1/3 women to men in 3 years for levels. So ensuring that managers, directors, VPs are all represented in that area. We do really well at the senior level and at the entry level, and ensuring that we're providing the same opportunities and growth and development for every level throughout the organization is really something that we've focused on. So right now, what are we working on in relation to those specific initiatives? One of the things we're really excited about is we're working on partnering with Vermont Works for Women. I know there's a few of you on the call, and we're solidifying some of those details where they have a mentorship program for high school junior and senior girls and non-gender conforming youth. The great thing about this, one of the things I think is great about this program is it's individuals who may not traditionally take part in a program like this. So we've recognized the need at Burton to make these connections earlier and even you could say high school is too late for a woman or a girl deciding to move into a STEM field. But this is one step in that direction, and we're engaging with the youth to educate them about Burton and who we are as a company. So that's one thing that we're looking forward to in the coming year. We also quickly discovered that women is being a part of Change the Story and the business peer exchange. We discovered that women are one piece of the larger puzzle. So we made our own internal Change Our Story group at Burton, which I'll go into a little bit later. And we also had, created by Donna Carpenter, who is Jake's wife. She created the Women's Leadership Initiative, which was a grassroots group within our own company. And we kind of want to join those two groups now into a larger DEI grassroots group within the organization. So understanding that women are definitely an area that we don't want to lose focus on, but there's a lot more opportunity in other areas that we need to also be aware of and start transitioning Burton into. So that evolution of this, our own Change Our Story group, is something that we're starting to work on as well. So those are some of our current initiatives, something that I'm really proud of over the past year. I think inclusion is now part of our language at Burton. I think for many years we may have been seen as exclusionary, and maybe some people still feel that way. I think our new CEO, John Lacey, and again, Donna Carpenter, Jake's wife and former CEO, have made it clear with our strategic plans that inclusion is where Burton's success lies. And so everyone's work needs to align with that. So much so that inclusive community is a peak on our trail map. That's our strategic plan. Of course, everything's related to a mountain. I'm really proud of the conversations that have taken place over the past year as a result of our participation in the Business Peer Exchange and Change the Story, from the Let's Talk Gender Cards conversations over and the Overcoming Bias workshops that, Change the Story leaders came in and put on for all of our hiring managers. There were and continue to be lots of discussions about how we can improve at Burton, and it's, we're definitely just getting started there. In terms of challenges, it feels like you're never doing enough. I think that was the hardest thing for me, especially. I feel like I want to, check things off and get it done. It's never enough, and it's never fast enough. And I think we're trained that way and want results immediately. And unfortunately, this type of big cultural change just doesn't happen overnight. We're not only fighting as it relates to the women goals, we're not only fighting against industry benchmarks in the outdoor industry, but also as well as traditional job field benchmarks. And that's why our goals are reflective of those struggles too, the 3 years out. And it's just, sometimes it's challenging to stay motivated, and I think that was really helpful to be a part of the Business Peer Exchange, to be able to collaborate with other businesses and work through these challenges and successes. And as a result of that, you're able to bring back ideas that were generated in these sessions, and then bring them back to Burton and see how they can be implemented. Sorry if I'm cruising through here, but I got my 5 minutes. So in words of wisdom, as much as I don't want to say it, I think it's necessary with any type of bigger initiative you want to put in place. You need that buy-in from senior management. And not only buy-in, but get them involved as much as possible. We made sure that they were present at the events that we put on, and that they were telling their directors to go to the things that we were inviting them to. So it wasn't just an invite that I was putting out. Like there needed to be, for the change to happen initially, there needed to be that top-down direction. And then employees see that they're participating, they get interested. It leads to more participation, I have found. And then get as much help as possible. So I was a part of a team of 3 that represented Burton's cohort at the Change the Story Business Peer Exchange. the three of us were able to bring that messaging back to Burton and translate what that means to us, to a team of 20 individuals. Like I mentioned earlier, we made our own Change Our Story group at Burton, and you know, the very first thing we did was we presented to our entire business in Burlington, and that's about 400 people. Not that many people went, unfortunately, but about 50 people did, which we were really greatly surprised with, and eventually like 20 individuals wanted to be a part of the larger group. And that was super helpful because we had an internal group brainstorming ideas that could specifically impact the goals I mentioned. And I think the more people you can get working towards your goal, the better. I can't change it by myself. And so it was really helpful to have these additional individuals. And based on the kind of ideation sessions, we were able to kind of end up with smaller teams or groups. And we broke those out by the general ideas. So the marketing team, programs team, women's team, and HR team. And what I requested of these groups was to have them complete a vision and priorities document. You know, pick one idea, what you're working on, and put timelines to it. Because I think the hardest thing with all of this is these are employees that have their day job, and this came secondary. If there's a timeline, it makes everything happen. And so, you know, the work in our budding partnership with Vermont Works for Women is actually a result of the programs team vision and priorities doc and their work and ideas around that. So that in a nutshell is is what Burton's working on. I see there's a bunch of chats.
Yeah, that's all good. So thank you so much, Ariana, just to even give us a little bit of a glimpse into the Burton world. And
yeah,
transition over now to Katie Brenes, who's in Human Resources at PC Construction, and gives us another flavor of what's happening.
Yes, good morning. So as Carrie mentioned, I'm Katie Brenes, and I am the HR journalist at PC Construction. And I was here to somewhat discuss the organizational development, and I think we have definitely utilized the system theory and kind of use the influence of systems to create the awareness around diversity and inclusion and the equity, and increase the equity within our organization. But one of our primary drivers of this initiatives has been for women who represent corporate office and construction operations. And we've just been involved with the Business Peer Exchange for several years. Rachel Fitch, she kind of started this participation. I was integrated 2 years ago, and we just kind of have gathered some of the data and share with our members, you know, with the executive team, as well as just all kinds of roles within the organization. We created a diversity and inclusion group, and we just trying to bring in men and women at all levels of our organization to learn about diversity and inclusion together, and to discuss the opportunities to build greater awareness at PC. And I thought it was really important for me to mention, you know, to incorporate men and how they are a huge part of this progress. So we ensure that our information was inclusive from the get-go. When we were creating this group, we wanted to make sure that males knew they were part of the solution and we needed their support. They needed to be our allies. We're working to, you know, on a development plan so we can communicate better around these issues and awareness within PC. And as I mentioned before, being part of a construction company, you're not in a centralized area. You know, one of our main challenges has been how do we reach all of our audiences in different locations. You know, we operate in the East Coast from Florida to Vermont, so that that creates a little bit of challenge to provide the same amount of education or inclusion at a company-wide level. So we're definitely working on that and how to make it more accessible to our our craft employees, as well as our corporate and administrative staff. So, you know, again, that inclusive messaging is not just the language, but also to include everybody. So we, you know, personally, I translate the documents to Spanish to ensure that the communication is clear and that we're reaching a big part of our population. And to just sponsoring events in our community that supports organizations that supports the advancement of this program. One of the successes that I guess I'm most proud of, it was PC just recently signed the Equal Pay Compact. And I think that was driven by our executive team and CEO, which is a really positive sign of that the diversity and inclusion awareness is gaining traction at PC. And I think just seeing those names and seeing their commitment to increase that equity within organization was huge. And I'm also speaking for the organization, but I also want to include my personal perspective. And as a female and a minority, it means so much. And it makes our work so much meaningful. And I think recognizing that my organization is moving towards that needle, it is great to hear. And I couldn't be more proud of PC Construction and definitely being part of that change. So I'm happy for that. And again, one of the challenges is our geographic makeup in PC. And we have been without a recruiter. So I have kind of taken some of the craft recruiter, and the HR manager has taken some of the admin. So to kind of like stay consistent with our affirmative recruiting practices, it has been a little bit more challenging because we're on top of doing my HR generalist jobs. I also play recruiter, and same goes with the HR manager. So I think we have finally brought someone aboard. She'll start on the 30th. This will be a different kind of training and different kind of inclusion, right? To do everything virtually is kind of new, but we are doing the best that we can. And the last question, wisdom. And I guess the best I can say is we have to have patience. There's a lot of facets to gender equity, and it takes time to understand them and to move the needle within an organization. You're changing the thinking, the behaviors and culture within an organization and individuals. But we can give up. We have to appreciate our wins, no matter what the size is. So we started really small, but we're working towards bigger plans. And I hope that by the time next year rolls around, we'll have even a lot more to give. But thank you so much for your time, and I'll pass it over.
All right, thank you so much, Katie. That was inspiring to hear. It's all those little wins that matter, right? That get us through.
Yes.
This.
Yes, indeed.
So I'm going to shift it now over to JP Ishak, who's project management at OnLogic. JP.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, and thank you for letting me participate in today's webinar. I'm glad we got to do this, even if it's virtual and not in person, although saving me the drive to Randolph is nice. So tiny bit about myself. So as Carrie said, I'm in the product management department at OnLogic, formerly Logic Supply, which some of you might be more familiar with. And currently I head the department as well as our pricing for all our products. So not in the traditional HR vein, but I've been a hiring manager there and involved in the hiring process for many years. I've also had the privilege of being involved in Business Peer Exchange in some capacity for the last few years, and also with the Male Champions for Change group, which is bringing together male identified allies and advocates to support the work of Vermont Women's Fund, Change the Story. I wanted to call us henchmen for Tiff Bloomley, but the acronym didn't really work quite as well. So Male Champions for Change is what we settled on for the time being. I do want to point out OnLogic is not currently a signee of the Equal Pay Compact, but I am working on that. And so, I'm also hoping to bring back some of the learnings from today's lesson to leadership team to continue to hammer home the point. That being said, we've been major beneficiaries over the years of the work of Change the Story and the Business Peer Exchange. And just to give a little plug, we had Jessica Nordhaus, who couldn't join us today, and Lindsay Lathrop come in and do unconscious bias training for our entire leadership team, which we've now taken elements of that and incorporated into our own leadership development program. So some of that work continues. You know, we're actually doing additional leadership trainings based around EQ, emotional intelligence, which is not something that is typically seen as a traditional leadership trait, especially not in Western culture, and especially not in a male-dominated company where leadership development tends to focus more on, you know, metrics and deliverables, and taking a more humanistic approach to it has actually already yielded some benefits and allowed us to start growing a new crop of leaders, which is also more inclusive as well. I want to come back to one of the points that Carrie Brown was talking about, number 5, the big item of recruiting more women and female identified folks into STEM careers. As an industrial computer and solutions company, that is something we feel very acutely. Unfortunately, I looked for the exact figures and I couldn't find them. The data I have is a little out of date, but it went something like this, in that about 30% or more of graduates from a lot of STEM programs are women, but less than 10% of them actually follow through in the field. And if you look at trade show and conference attendance, it's closer to 1% of people participating in you know, panels and activities like that. That is a appalling fall off, and there are a lot of factors driving that, obviously, as has been touched on here, but creating a more inclusive environment within STEM, and also trying to reach upstream and look at the talent and bring in more folks who are women or female identified has been one of our key challenges, but also one of our sort of growing successes. So one of the other things we took away from Business Peer Exchange over the years was the idea of creating more inclusive job postings. So we get involved in a lot of the, I think it was the Women Can Do conference we've attended a few years. We've sent folks to the Women's Economic Opportunity Conference. We look for opportunities to bring primarily female students in to give them tours and do hands-on workshops, all with the aim of, you know, expanding the talent pipeline that's coming in, especially given Vermont's notorious for losing talent, you know, sort of that brain drain we talk about. And so that's one of the things we're working on the most. It historically has been driven by the HR team, but we've tried to be more inclusive and actually involve the hiring managers in the process as well. So as one of those managers, I'm the one writing the job postings because I know the jobs better for my department and what the responsibilities are, but training people like me to be more intentional and conscious of the language that we're using and posting them to make them more hospitable and less exclusionary. You know, removing a lot of the gendered language as much as we're able, and making it, or the other tack we've taken is not just removing gendered language, but inserting language that is appealing to kind of both types of thinking, more or less. And so that's actually been a modest success so far. Within the product management and engineering teams, we've historically been exclusively male, and over the last couple of years, we've hired about half a dozen women into those departments. It's a step in the right direction, but it's only one step. And so we've gotten a lot of accolades over the years for having something like 35% women in a traditional, you know, where 10% would be considered the norm in our industry, but we're not really going to be satisfied until it's more representative of the local demographics. And so that's something we continue to work on, but we're really pleased with the success we've seen so far. And again, grateful for the help from Change the Story and Business Peer Exchange that we've received. The other thing I want to talk about briefly that's actually been part of the core approach of the company since the founding back in 2002 is full pay transparency. And what that means is that every single employee at OnLogic, from the day they start, can access a file. It's pretty simple. It's just a Google Doc at this point, managed by the HR team, that allows them to see the salaries of every other person in the company, including our folks in Malaysia, Taiwan, the Netherlands in their native currency. And that includes any sort of additional incentives paid to, for instance, the sales team or management, so that people can understand kind of where they fit. It's a tremendous tool. It's only one tool in the toolbox, so to speak, but it's one that we use to foster dialogue. Now, I want to be fully candid here. It does not eliminate all pay disparity in and of itself. It is not some silver bullet for that. But what it does is allow us to foster that dialogue earlier in the process, and really we try to drive it home with people as soon as they start that this is a topic we can discuss. This is a topic we want you to understand, the value that you bring, the revenue that you generate, and how that corresponds to your pay. And if I can, the biggest challenges that we face, aside from the STEM-based talent pool that we're kind of working with and trying to address, is simply the fact that in American culture we are not typically conditioned to want to talk about salary. In particular, a lot of the facts that I've learned from my time at Business Peer Exchange is, women self-select out of job postings, and they also do not necessarily advocate for themselves very well in either initial salary negotiations during the hiring process or subsequent salary discussions at annual reviews and one-on-ones with management. On top of that, it's not something that most managers are super comfortable having a blunt dialogue about either. And so as open as we try to be about it, without putting in the proper infrastructure to address that, it's really easy for people to have very frustrating and discouraging conversations that end up going nowhere. And so one of the things we're working on now is actually, I mentioned some of the leadership training. We're actually working on training the management team how to be more receptive to those conversations and how to be more prepared to have the conversation, facilitate the conversation, and then also escalate the conversation with the employee to ensure that they're getting the visibility and understanding kind of how that process works. And so that's something that we see a lot of value in. It's obviously something that makes some folks uncomfortable. Pay transparency is such a rare thing that having that kind of full open books approach to it is a little off-putting to some folks, especially people coming from larger organizations, Fortune 500 companies, et cetera. When they interview or start at the company, some of them are frankly nervous about that. And we've actually had a few folks self-select out of the hiring process because they were uncomfortable with the idea of having everyone just explicitly know their salary. And that comes across to us as sort of a cultural mismatch. I'm sure they were a good candidate, but if that's the kind of thing they have real trouble with, maybe we're better off going in a different direction. And so we use that as sort of a real key barometer when we bring people on. And by the way, I'm trying to stick to my allotted time. I'm happy to go into this offline with anybody that's curious to learn more about it. Feel free to reach out to me on either LinkedIn or via email, which I think Carrie is sharing with folks. If I can end with any words of wisdom, for me, as often as I'm exposed to this data, and I have been a few times over the years, it continues to really challenge what I take for granted. And as a kind of straight white male middle manager in the U.S., I'm by default the poster boy for the problem. And so trying to be more active and intentional in helping be a part of the solution and trying to recruit other folks to that cause, it's that avoidance goes nowhere. Acknowledging that there is an issue is a challenge to get a lot of people to that point. But once you do, you can turn them into really, really strong advocates. And I think someone said at a meeting I was at recently, converts make the strongest zealots. So looking to convert more people and really open their eyes to the challenges and the successes that are being had in this arena has sort of become one of my personal missions. And I look forward to continuing that with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you, JP. Just a quick question. How many employees do you have on Logic?
We are right now at about 175 globally. Most of them are here in the South Burlington headquarters.
Super. Thank you. And thank you for giving your perspective. It's really helpful to hear. We have a few minutes for questions, and I did want to reiterate what JP said, is that each of the presenters agreed to give their email addresses, so it'll be part of the follow-up information that we send. So if something in particular is relevant to you and you want to have a one-on-one kind of exchange, all three presenters have said that they're welcome to that. And so any questions that people want to raise at this juncture? Just type them in. And while we're waiting, I want to offer Tiff, based on what you heard today, is there anything else that's coming to you that you think would be useful to just share to a wider audience about, bringing these best practices into people's companies?
Sure. I wanted to make a quick point that follow up to what JP said. Research seems to indicate now that women are actually negotiating their salaries, and they are not as successful as men. And so there are, a couple of links that we can include to, that relate to that research in the follow-up information that we send to you. I actually see that Sarah has asked a question. I'm curious about whether or not folks have brought this information to companies with unions, and what is the impact of union organizing and opportunity on this wage data? I don't believe that any of these employers have unions, correct? And Sarah, I'm just curious about what information you're talking about. Are you talking about best practice as it relates to equity issues, or is it data on the wage gap? I'm just not quite sure what information you are. And I think for this purpose, you should feel free to unmute yourself and.
Hello, I'm typing away furiously. So I work at the University of Vermont, where there are unions, and then there are also a lot of us who are not part of any type of union. And so I'm thinking about the ways that also on a campus where we think about people who identify as women as a kind of a majority minority, right? There's actually more female students than male students, and more female employees than male employees, but we still see pay inequity. And I'm just wondering about the ways that union organizing has or has not been able to kind of get at that equity point, especially as we think about how folks try to negotiate for parity.
I'm happy to start with a response to you, and I think that I'd love for Carrie to comment on that if she would like to. For a long time, it was very difficult for women to get into unions, certain kinds of unions, right? But unions have played a kind of leveling role in salaries for men and women, in that there are pretty clear stations of the cross. There are it's spelled out how one moves up the salary scale. And now there are, people can be promoted at different rates and for different reasons, but there's a whole union structure in place to review that. So actually the role of unions has actually reduced the wage gap, at least in say the public sector, and I would imagine also in higher ed and K through 12 education. Carrie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that in general, we see less of a wage gap among organized workers, people who are members of unions. And a big part of that probably has to do with wage transparency, as JP was talking about. So when you look at public employees, municipal or state government employees, or like UVM is the same way, anybody can literally go online and see how much money everybody makes. And so you have, just empirically, there is less of a wage gap when there is full wage transparency. And I'm taking your point that it doesn't get rid of it all completely. And so I think there is a strong role that unions could be playing as they're thinking about their contracts, as they're thinking about their structures, looking at it with an eye towards gender equity, which I don't think is a common way that they've been looking at it, because none of us have. So I'm gonna note this and think about ways that we can talk about it in our conversations with labor. And then for those of you who are, if anyone is a member of a union, to be thinking about that when your contract is coming up for renegotiation, it's maybe an opportunity to inject that in there.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. So we are coming a little bit toward time, so I'm going to move us forward. Just give me a moment here. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's an opportunity, though, you know, we're fighting COVID-19 and it might not be the right opportunity, but for now, there's an opportunity to think about in the next few minutes. We've given you a lot of data. We hope that we've given you some ideas. And Carrie, maybe just mentioning these few resources that we'll be sending to you through the follow-up resource list.
Sure. Yeah. So just a few things, and as Carrie said, you'll get more information about this. We have a new website the Commission on Women just recently completed. It's called Workplaces for All, and it's resources for combating sexual harassment and workplace discrimination of all kinds. And so we'll send you a link to that. It's a website, but then there are also printed materials that are available to you. I mentioned before the strategies sheet that is on our website, and also you probably all got emailed to you at some point, but it's just a gigantic laundry list of all kinds of things that one might be able to do to address equal pay. It's not meant to be a checklist by any means. It's just a list of things for inspiration. Carrie mentioned Equal Pay Day is coming up. I do just want to make one little correction to something about that Equal Pay Day. It's a symbolic day into the year into which all women on average have to work to make what men made the previous year. And it's not specifically for white women, it's everybody, it's the average of all women. But then when we look at non-white women, we see that Black women, Latino women, Native American women, they have to work a lot farther into the year, that the wage gap for them is a lot bigger than it is for women on average. So we are staying at home for Equal Pay Day this year and using social media to talk about it. We're going to have hashtags that you can use, hashtag equal pay. We will send you links to ways that you can participate in a social media campaign. We'll ask you to tag VCW and Change the Story and the Vermont Works for Women and the other Change the Story partners. And the governor's going to sign a proclamation, and at any rate, so it's a way to build awareness.
Awesome.
And I also mentioned before the Change the Story, Let's Talk Gender conversation cards. You can get those online, sent to you for free, and we'll include a link to that in the materials that we send out to you.
Yeah, and then as well, we'll be sending the Change the Story report that Tiff presented and other opportunities. You can share that with your own staff at your companies. And then, even if it's something like a planning meeting is, all I can organize at this point is to commit to getting together. So really there's an opportunity to think about what works for you. And so here are some thoughts. We don't have a lot of time, but based on what you heard today, I'd love to just take a moment for a little bit of quiet, introverted preference time about what changes are you inspired to make? Are there any easy changes, low-hanging fruit? And who might support you? One of the things that we heard is not doing it together, by having support of senior management, that there's allies, because one person can't, do it alone. If there are challenges that you want to just jot down that you might anticipate and possible ways to address them. And then I always say, when we're looking at changes, what is a next step that's so small that you could actually start it today? i.e., I'm going to send out an email to my colleague at work to say, let's have a meeting. Whatever it is, I'm going to write on my to-do list, whatever, I'm going to look at this material on the Workplaces for All. What really, really, really teeny. So let's just take a quiet moment collectively to reflect. Okay. And so we can't have a full 3 minutes because I'm completely committed to having everyone move on with their days. Let me just tell you a moment on next steps. So today we're going to send you a quick eval about how today went. This is our first time we're trying this in an online format. We'd love to hear pragmatically, is this something to do again? You know, what went well, what didn't? We're going to send you a resource list today from our conversation with a lot of the links that we talked about so that you can actually move into action. We're hoping in the ideal world, you know, with everything being as flexible as we need to be, is that you can go back to your companies while there's this energy and excitement and begin taking some form of action in whatever way that it makes sense for you. Some of you might be totally swamped with COVID-19 and others actually might find that there's a little bit more space. So however you need to do, it's like flexible and moving forward. On April 17th, Lily at the Vermont Commission on Women, we're going to send you a quick check-in form to actually ask you how you're doing. You know, we want to see if this is inspiring people to be able to take action or if there's challenges. We want to hear about it so that we can hopefully for May 1st have a press release to go out. And then ongoing, we'll keep you informed of events and opportunities. And then one of the eval questions will be, is that would it make sense to have another educational opportunity in the fall? So we are creating a cadence where we're getting compact signers together every so often. And as I said before, we're so excited that we have over 200 companies now in Vermont to help build this momentum. So I want to leave you with a thought that cumulatively, small decisions, choices, actions make a very big difference. Thank you to all of you for taking this time. I'm wishing you all the best to stay grounded, keep your hearts open, and take care of what needs to be taken care of. Thank you. If the